The Judicial Services Commission has agreed to rerun interviews for Constitutional Court judges after a settlement with the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. Now, in court papers, CASAC sought to have the process nullified on the grounds that the JSC did not properly deliberate on the performance of all candidates. The settlement means the shortlisted names submitted to President Cyril Ramaphosa have now been set aside and fresh interviews will be conducted. For reaction, I'm joined by Judges Matter researcher Zikhona Ndlebe. Ms. Ndlebe, good to have you with us this afternoon. What are your reactions on the case that CASAC had brought forward? Do you think it is justified?
Hi, good afternoon to you and your viewers. We think that it is justified that the JSC has decided to enter into a settlement agreement with CASAC, and the terms of the agreement is that the interviews will be nullified and a new set of interviews will take place. So this means that it is a great win because the JSC has come to a realization that its interview process is perhaps flawed and they need to consider changing the process. And in fact, we would suggest that they have a set criteria that they will follow when interviewing candidates and the set criteria that they will follow when deliberating on the candidates that have been interviewed.
So what does the restarting of this process actually mean?
So it means that there will be a new set of interviews. So the candidates that have been interviewed by the JSC and that were recommended for appointment will have to undergo a fresh set of interviews. So the previous interviews that had been undertaken in April will be set aside. They are nullified, they're invalid because of the reasons that they were not conducted properly. They were unfair to certain candidates. So the candidates that were interviewed in April will be interviewed again. But at the moment, there is no set date when those interviews will take place. All we have currently is the dates for the October interviews that will, in any event, would have taken place. So the JSC needs to set a date for the new set of interviews that had taken place in April to take place, perhaps after the October interviews or during the October interviews. We are not sure what the JSC will decide on at this point in time because they have not said anything about the agreement yet. But there is a statement from CASAC saying that the JSC and CASAC have entered into a settlement agreement.
There are some quarters, Ms. Ndlebe, who have expressed, I guess, dis-ease about the involvement of politicians in the interview processes. What are your sentiments regarding this?
We are also very displeased about the involvement of politicians in the JSC interview process. But with that, that's considering what has been said by the President in the Zondo Commission. But that aside, politicians have to be involved in the interview process because they form part of the JSC. We've got MPs who are ANC members, MPs who are EFF members that sit in the JSC interview process. And that is acceptable because that is the composition of the JSC. However, if there are going to be outside influences, then that is not acceptable at all. If there are any other influences outside the JSC, those influences have to be transparent. They cannot take place in dark corners. There has to be transparency, and there has to be good reasons why there are people that want to contribute to the JSC process, because at the end of the day, it's the JSC alone that has to make a decision on the people to appoint as judges, no one else.
You mentioned the statement that was made by President Cyril Ramaphosa at the State Capital Commission of Inquiry about the appointment of judges and the fact that the ANC was somehow involved in at least trying to get some of the judges recommended. By virtue of some of the MPs sitting at the JSC as well as politicians sitting at the JSC, one doesn't really separate themselves in the sense that you belong to a particular party, and so you will bring your party policies into play, you will bring the recommendations of your party into play. How do you suggest that that can be balanced?
So you're absolutely correct. The problem is that if you're an ANC member or an EFF member and there are deliberations that are taking place outside of the JSC about the appointment of judges, the chances are, as a JSC commissioner, you will want to carry out the mandate of your political party, which is not acceptable. So that is why we have been saying for the longest time that the JSC needs to have a set criteria. So the JSC needs to have a standard that it will measure a candidate against in order for them to be recommended for appointment. And that standard is something that the JSC needs to sit down and decide on. There is history of a criteria that has been spoken about back years ago, but the JSC has not followed through on that. But on the flip side, although some members of the JSC sit and they are MPs and belong to political parties, we also have advocates, we also have attorneys, we've got people that have been appointed by the president who are not politicians. So that, in a sense, does balance the dynamics of the JSC. So we can be at ease that it is not only politicians that are members of the JSC. There are also other members who do not belong to political parties, such as law professors, advocates, attorneys. But at the end of the day, the JSC, regardless of the settlement agreement that it has entered into with CASAC, it still needs to have a set criteria, because the interviews are going to be rerun. But what about the future? What happens in the future? What if the interviews that take place, for example, in October, are also flawed as the interviews that took place in April? What criteria, what standard, what is the proper process that is going to be followed by the JSC at the end of the day? And that is something that the JSC needs to sit down and think about and have something in writing that it will conduct the interview process measuring itself against.
The mandate for the JSC, as you're saying, needs to be really clear, and the type of questions that they need to ask need to be very clear. I want to point to something that CASAC said as part of their arguments for wanting these interviews to be rerun. They say that the panel went beyond questions that the nominees should be expected to answer. For example, Judge David Unterhalter, he was not included because of his association with the SA Jewish Board of Deputies. What do you believe ought to be the criteria? What are the no-go areas that should be put in place that judges are not expected to account on, do you believe?
Okay, so there is a constitutional provision, Section 174 of the Constitution, which requires that a candidate must be, or a person to be appointed as a judge or a judicial officer must be fit and proper, must be appropriately qualified. But the person must also have knowledge of the law, must be able to carry forward the transformation agenda, must be able to perform in the position that they will be appointed to, which also goes back to acting. But you've asked what are the no-go areas. We think that the questions have to be fair. And in questions being fair, candidates must be, for example, forewarned about questions that are going to be posed to them, which have been raised by various law bodies and which might count against them. But they have to be prepared enough. They cannot be ambushed, first of all. And then we need to look at the equality clause as well, which is something that we think should be considered when having a set criteria discussed by the JSC. So if questions are relating to marital status, race, gender, sexual orientation, and belief, religion, those questions are very sensitive, and if they are going to be asked to candidates, they should not put candidates in a bad position. They should not count against candidates, because we have to look at equality as well. So at the end of the day, judges are human beings. They have their own preferences in terms of how they live their lives, their beliefs, their marital status, sexual orientation, etc. And those are very sensitive questions. So the JSC needs to have a set criteria and try to stay away from questions that might lead to a perception that the JSC is biased against certain people or is unfair towards a certain group of people. So it's very sensitive. That is why the JSC needs to sit down and come up with a criteria that will be fair to everyone and consider constitutional provisions as well.
We see the process now also being extended to law bodies as well as members of the general public, and going beyond just the Constitutional Court judges and the appointment thereof, but other courts in the different provinces, the high courts, for example, in Limpopo, in Mpumalanga, in Gauteng, also judges needing to be appointed for the electoral commissions, electoral courts, etc. But what type of input is going to be sought then from the public and law bodies?
Well, law bodies and the general public can comment on any candidate that has been nominated for interviewing by the JSC. That there is no limit as to what comments should be provided to the JSC, but the JSC will have to consider whether the comments are relevant to the appointment of the particular candidate.
All right, we'll leave it at that then for this afternoon. Ms. Zikhona Ndlebe, thank you very much for your time as she rounds up for us the interview process with the Judicial Services Commission, which will be restarting, and all those who were interviewed will be re-interviewed, pretty much starting from scratch. But as she says, very important for the Judicial Services Commission to outline exactly what the parameters are of those questions, that they need to be fair. Everybody needs to be given a proper and fair opportunity to state their case, as well as their qualifications and justifications for those positions.